Hello friends, it's Lisa, and today I'm going to be chatting about the books that I read in March. I'm going to be doing my March wrap-up. I read 6 books this month, which is definitely not my best reading month. I think it's fine. I'm happy with it, but definitely not the most amount of books I've ever read in a month. I definitely got into a bit of a slump in the month of March, not even just a reading slump, just like a life slump in general. I feel like March can be a really tough month. The end of winter, just like when spring is so close, but you're still going through those gray, not so great end of winter days, it can just be a bit tough. I was just not feeling my best this month, but I'm happy that I did read at least 6 books in the month of March. That's better than nothing. So yeah, I still read 6 books this month, and I thought we could chat about them. Hopefully, because I only have 6 books to talk about, this video won't be too long and I won't ramble on and on for too long, but I tend to ramble, so let's just get into it. So the first book that I read in the month of March feels like so long ago. I read Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. I felt like I read this book years ago. It just, beginning of March seems so far away, but this was the first book I read this month, and I gave it a 4.25 star rating. I know that's very specific, but 4 stars felt too low, 4.5 seemed too high, so I settled for the 4.25. So this is a standalone YA fantasy. You're following Elizabeth, who has grown up in one of the great libraries, and she has been training her whole life to become a warden, and the wardens are the people that kind of protect everyone from the magical grimoires. And these magical grimoires, these magical books, contain all of the evil knowledge on sorcery. Elizabeth has been told her whole life that sorcerers are evil and that the magic that they use is evil, so she wants to become a warden to protect the people from these magical books that can also turn into monsters if provoked, which I think is just such a cool thing about this world. And one night, the magical library that Elizabeth resides in is attacked, and Elizabeth is put to blame for that attack. So she gets taken to the capital by Nathaniel Thorne, who is a sorcerer, and she is going to be tried for her crimes. But when they get there, the two of them kind of realize that there is this greater conspiracy and this greater problem happening. So the two of them, plus Nathaniel's friend Silas, have to come together to figure out a way to put a stop to this conspiracy and these plans that could end up like destroying their world. So my biggest thing with this book is the characters. I absolutely loved the characters. I loved Elizabeth. I loved Nathaniel so much. And I also loved Silas. I loved their friendship and just the dynamic between all of the 3 of them. And I also really loved the romance that developed between Nathaniel and Elizabeth. I just was so obsessed with these characters individually, their friendships, their romantic relationships, and I just really liked the dynamic between them. Also, the atmosphere was really great with all of these libraries, and even just like the other places that were described, the other houses, or just like really anywhere that these characters went. I thought the atmosphere was really great. I could very clearly visualize everything, and it just felt very cozy, even though, you know, some of these situations that these characters were in were a bit more stressful. It was just like a very cozy, atmospheric read. I think also as like a book lover, having so many settings be in libraries and have books play such an important role in this story and in this world, and these magical books being able to turn into creatures. Like, it was just such a cool concept. And even though, like I was saying, I feel like I read this book so long ago, even though it was just the beginning of March, it just feels like a really long time ago, I have not really stopped thinking about these characters and this world. And also, when I really enjoy a book, I feel like my first instinct is to go onto the internet and like find fan art and just like find other people talking about a book that I've read and loved, and that's exactly what I did with this book. So I feel like this is the type of thing that I could reread in the future and revisit and love it even more upon a reread. Maybe give it a 5 star on a reread. I definitely want to revisit this at some point. I definitely want to get my own like physical copy and revisit it and see the characters again. I know there's also a little like short story novella thing that just came out about these characters, which I need to read. So yeah, I definitely think revisiting it, I could love it even more. This time around, I just feel like the first half, I was super into it. I was getting 5-star feelings from it within the first half of the book. And then the second half, I still enjoyed it. I still enjoyed my time. I know a lot of people like read the second half and they don't enjoy it. I still liked what was happening. I liked where the plot went. I liked obviously what was going on with the characters, but I just wasn't loving it as much as I did in the first half. I feel like the plot of this book went in so many different directions that I didn't anticipate, and in some ways it was good because there were a lot of things that I thought were going to be things that we didn't find out or get revealed until the end of the book, but then we end up getting them revealed much earlier on than I thought. So it went in different directions that I wasn't anticipating, which was good, but I also think in some ways there were certain things I thought were gonna happen, it didn't happen, and I maybe would have enjoyed it if it went in certain different ways, but I still really enjoyed it. Like I said, I think I could give this 5 stars on a reread, and I think for the most part, for a standalone fantasy, it was paced really well and everything wrapped up in a way that was very satisfying. And the ending of this book, so good. So yeah, gave this a 4.25, and I feel like continuing to talk about it makes me feel like I maybe should raise my rating, but I definitely feel like there were certain paths and directions that this book went on with the plot and everything that I just didn't love as much as I could have, which is why the second half of the book I didn't love as much as the first half, but still overall really enjoyed it and can't wait to reread it in the future. And then after I read Sorcery of Thorns, I was like, wow, I really enjoyed this. I loved the characters, the atmosphere was great. Why don't I read An Enchantment of Ravens, which is also by Margaret Rogerson. This is her debut, and Sorcery of Thorns was her second book, so I think I might have done myself a disservice by going backwards and not reading her debut first, because I definitely didn't like An Enchantment of Ravens as much. So in An Enchantment of Ravens, you're following Isabel, who paints portraits, and she often paints portraits of the Fae, because the Fae are very interested in human craft, in things humans create. They don't have the same feelings or the same understanding of human emotions, so they're very interested in the way humans are able to create. And one day, the Autumn Prince comes to Isabel to get a portrait done. And while she is painting this portrait of the Autumn Prince, she realizes that there's something that isn't right with his portrait. She can't get it right until she realizes that the very human emotion of sorrow is in his eyes. And so she paints that accurately, and when that portrait gets revealed in the Fae courts, the Autumn Prince is upset because having these human emotions in his eyes in this portrait could be seen as a weakness to his enemies. So he goes back to Isabel and is like, why did you do that? That's not okay. You're coming with me back to the courts to face trial for what you've done, basically. The human emotions that she painted in his eyes is viewed as a crime to him. So he's really just throughout this whole book bringing her to the Fae courts to face trial for this crime that she committed. And that's really it for the plot. That's what happens at the very beginning of the book, and the rest of the book is them just traveling to the Fae courts. That's really it. It's really no plot, just vibes. I will say again, I love the atmosphere within this book. I think Margaret Rogerson is just able to create such a vivid atmosphere. I loved all of the descriptions of the forest, and when we got to the courts, the different things that they were seeing, it was very vivid and very easy to picture in my mind. And like I said, there really isn't much of a plot. This is very much focused on the characters and their relationship that develops while they're kind of traveling through the fairylands to the courts. I have no issues with character-driven or character-focused books. Those typically tend to be my favorite, but they're my favorites when I care about the characters. I didn't really feel that strongly about these characters, both Isabel and what was his name? Rook. That was the Autumn Prince, his name. His name is Rook. I thought they were fine. I think the biggest thing with this book, I gave it 3 stars. I don't know if I said that. I gave it 3 stars, which may have been a bit generous, but I gave it 3 because it didn't make me feel strongly one way or the other. I felt so neutral reading this entire book. The characters, like I said, I really didn't feel strongly about them one way or the other, and when this is such a character-focused novel, I feel like I need to care for that to work. I liked Isabel. I didn't love her, but I thought she was fine. She was a fine character to be in the perspective of and in the mind of. And Rook was really interesting because the first handful of chapters when he was getting his portrait done, I thought he had a bit more personality, and then when he came to collect Isabel to bring her to the Fae courts to face trial is when I was like, where did his personality go? The rest of the book, it just disappeared. Everything that you saw in the beginning, gone. I don't know what happened. He just had no personality throughout the entire book, and I don't understand how so much changed from the first couple of chapters to what his character was doing the rest of the book. So yeah, I didn't dislike these characters, but I didn't really love them either, and I feel like this book, their relationship, the love that they share caused so many problems and conflict within the story, and that was really where a lot of the plot actually came in, and I just didn't care for them or their relationship. I didn't dislike it, but I didn't really love it either. I just didn't care. Yeah, so I just thought this was a fine read. I read the whole book in one day, basically in one sitting. So, I mean, it had to be interesting enough to keep me engaged enough to read it all in one sitting, but I don't know, it was very fine. It just didn't do anything that I could see myself being super angry or really hating, but it didn't do anything to make me feel obsessed or love it either. There really just isn't that much to say about this book. It was just fine. So after An Enchantment of Ravens, I ended up picking up Golden Sun by Pierce Brown, and I ended up giving this 4 stars. I initially gave it 4.5, but then once the kind of ending wore off on me, I was like, was it really that high of a rating? I don't think so. So I gave it a 4, and I also ended up lowering my rating to Red Rising to a 3.5, by the way. Just a side note, if anyone cares. I just love to change my ratings. This is why I don't do wrap-ups, because I tell you something one month and then the next month I'm like, yeah, actually, I changed my rating. But this one I gave a 4. So this is the second book in the Red Rising series, so I don't want to say what this book is technically about, but in the series in general, you start off with Darrow, and he is a red, and the kind of class system, the caste system in this world is based off of colors, and reds are at the bottom. And our main character, Darrow, has been under the surface of Mars mining away to eventually make the surface habitable for future generations. And through certain circumstances, he ends up finding out that that is actually a lie, and a lot of the other colors have been living above the surface on Mars for years and years and years, and the reds are basically just being used and manipulated to provide for the people who live on the surface. So Darrow ends up getting swept up into the rebellion against the golds, who are the ones at the very top of this caste system. And Darrow is able to be a part of this rebellion by pretending to be a gold. He is a red pretending to be a gold, and he like infiltrates their academy and tries to get closer to them to be able to push this rebellion forward. So I feel like I can never explain this series well, and I also feel like I've explained it so many times so far this year. Just between wrap-ups and vlogs, I keep talking about this series. But this is the second book in the Red Rising series, like I said, and I definitely like this one more than the first one. This book took me a little bit longer to get into. I feel like part one for me was just a bit of a struggle for me to get through, but once we got to part two and then part three, I was like, okay, I feel similarly about this like I did to Red Rising, the first book in the series, where it was really interesting, lots of twists and turns, but there was some sort of disconnect between me and the characters. I don't mind Darrow as main character as much in Golden Sun as I did in Red Rising. He didn't annoy me as much in this book, but he still kind of did things I was like, why are we doing that? Like, I don't know, he just makes a lot of decisions, and sometimes his inner monologue is just so annoying. So yeah, I was feeling pretty similarly about this book like I was with Red Rising until part four. Part four is where things just go completely off the rails, and this is where I really love Pierce Brown's writing, because he is able to write twists and turns and plot twists, just so many things so well. I feel like I never know where his books are going, what's going to happen next, and just like the ending of this book is so wild. And I feel like throughout this whole series, I've been saying I haven't felt super invested in the characters, and I think like the world is interesting, the politics is interesting, I'm just not super invested in the characters. There's a few that I like, but not a ton that I'm obsessed with, but I feel like the ending of this book solidified me actually being like, no wait, I think I am more invested in these characters than I realized. But that was only in part four. I feel like parts 1, 2, and 3, I was feeling like this was fine. This was a fine read. I was enjoying my time, but I wasn't obsessed with it. And speaking of Pierce Brown's writing, I think where I don't love it so much is sometimes the way he writes Darrow's inner monologue, I think is really obnoxious. So I don't love that. And I also find that sometimes I am getting confused in certain scenes. I just can't always understand where we are and what's happening. I have a hard time grasping like the location. And I'm the type of person where if I can't like visualize where the characters are or what's kind of happening around them, I'll be reading what's like happening and what the conversations are, but I'm not fully understanding it because I'm just trying to get a gauge on what is going on around them. And so sometimes I can find his writing a bit confusing and I'm not always following on what's happening. Eventually I do figure it out. It just kind of sometimes takes me a minute to fully understand where we are and what's happening. But yeah, I'm glad that that ending happened because it made me realize that I do think I was enjoying the series and these characters more than I realized. So going into book 3, which we'll talk about in my April wrap up, it made me a little bit more excited to get into that book. I immediately placed a hold on book 3 after finishing Golden Sun, so I think that was a good sign. Yeah, this one I feel like pacing wise was just a little bit up and down for me, and throughout most of the book I didn't know how invested I was in the characters, and also Pierce Brown's writing is not always my fave, but I do like some aspects of it. I think the world is interesting. Politics are great. And yeah, that's kind of, those are my overall thoughts on the series so far. Like I said, we will be talking about Morningstar in my April wrap up, or in a vlog. I will be talking about it in a vlog as well if you can't wait till my April wrap up. I feel like my words are not working today, so I apologize if any of these reviews aren't really making much sense. If you want clarification, leave a comment down below. I'm just trying my best. And I feel like every wrap up I've complained about not being able to speak. So should she be continuing to do wrap ups? We don't know. Anyway, moving on. The next book that I read in the month of March was a reread of Criers by Nina Varela, and this time around I gave it a 4.5 stars. I initially gave this 5 stars, but I did lower my rating. This is the first book in a duology, and in this world there are humans and automi. The automi were created for a queen long before our main characters, Crier and Ayla, are even alive. The queen wanted a child but was unable to get pregnant, so she wanted someone to make her a child. So that is how the automi were kind of created. They're very human-like, but they're not quite there. They are made, they are created, so they're not quite human, but very close. And eventually the Autumn kind of overthrow the humans and become the rulers of the world. So we have Crier, who is an Automa, and she is the daughter of the king. And then we have Ayla, who is a human. And even still, years later, there's a lot of tension between the humans and the Automa. Ayla is actually a part of the rebellion against them, and she specifically wants to get revenge on the king because he is the reason why her family have been killed. And her plan for revenge is to kill Crier. And this book, you see her get an opportunity to get closer to Crier and actually be able to get that revenge. However, she ends up, getting closer to Crier, getting to know her, and perhaps some romantic feelings get in the way, but also just like certain information that both of them learn and see that they can kind of work together to maybe change the future and work towards a better future for both the Automa and humans. So it's really interesting. I think it's such an interesting world. It's a true enemies to lovers story because they are literally at war with one another and are very much different creatures. And I feel like this series in general just has a lot of my buzzwords, a lot of things I really enjoy in books. We have court intrigue, political intrigue, there's a romance, it's enemies to lovers like I was saying, and I just really like the characters. I feel like that's where this time around my rating lowered a little bit, just because I do feel like a lot of the side characters weren't super fleshed out. It really only feels like Ayla and Crier are the only ones that really have much of a personality. And I wish we had gotten a little bit more from the side characters, specifically the kind of main villain of this series. I wish we had seen a little bit more scenes with them and a little bit more of their backstory, gotten a little bit more moments with them to fully understand them as a villain. I feel like how can they be so scary when we barely see them? Okay, my camera died in the middle of me speaking. Now someone's doing yard work, dogs are barking. I just want to finish my thoughts on Crier's War real fast. Basically what I was saying is that I just wish we had gotten a little bit more from the side characters. I think Crier and Ayla are really fleshed out characters. They have very distinct personalities. I really like them individually, but also when they come together and start working together, and also their like relationship. But I just wish we had gotten a little bit more from some of the side characters, especially like the more villain character. I wish we had gotten a little bit more from him. But yeah, I think this is such an interesting world, such great characters. I love the enemies to lovers situation. That really is like the highlight of the series, but the world is very interesting. The politics are great, and I wanted to do a reread of this so that I could finally read the sequel. I read this back in 2020 and I have yet to pick up the sequel, and so I'm hoping to do that soon now that this is all fresh in my mind because I forgot so much of it, which is why I wanted to do a reread. Yeah, really excited now that I finished this to get into the sequel, Ironheart, and finally see how this series wraps up because I need to know. I'm very invested, very excited to see what happens next. All right, next up I read The Davenports by Crystal Marquis, and I am so sad that I did not really love this. I gave this 2.5 stars. Not terrible. I did round up on Goodreads because this is a debut, and I think we will get into it, but I think that is still such an important story and I'm glad that it exists, but I just really didn't love it, unfortunately, which is so sad. I was so excited. It's been described as like a Black Bridgerton and it's a historical romance, and I was just really excited for it. I thought it'd be something I really would enjoy, but unfortunately I did not. So this book, you're following the Davenports. You're following 2 of the Davenport girls and 2 of their friends. You get 4 different girls' perspectives. So we have Olivia Davenport. She is the eldest sister, and she has always kind of done what is expected of her from her parents and from society. She knows she needs to find a husband. She meets Jacob Lawrence, seems like a great fit. That'll do. But then she ends up meeting someone who is a leader of the civil rights movement, and she ends up kind of getting swept up into that and getting involved in that movement while also being interested in this guy. And then we have Helen Davenport, the youngest sister, and she is kind of the opposite of Olivia, where she doesn't really want to do what society wants her to do, what her family wants to do. She has no interest in getting married. She just wants to work for her father's carriage company and work on fixing cars with her brother John. But then that kind of gets challenged when she ends up developing feelings for her sister's suitor, Jacob Lawrence. Then we have Amy Rose, who is a childhood friend of these girls, but also is now their maid. She now works for the family, and she kind of has her own dreams of wanting to set out on her own, open her own hair salon. She also ends up having feelings for John Davenport, which, as she works for the family, that gets a little bit complicated. And then we have Ruby, who her family is not doing well financially. Her father's running for mayor, and I think that has caused a lot of financial strain on them. So they want her to make a match with John Davenport because that will help them with financial security. However, her plan to make John Davenport jealous with somebody else, she starts seeing somebody else to make him jealous and make him propose. She ends up kind of starting to develop feelings for that person. So as you can tell, It's very messy. A lot of tangled webs here and there, lots of romantic interest in places they shouldn't. I was really excited for the mess and for the drama, and I don't know, I felt a little underwhelmed. I do want to say, even though some things for the actual story and characters and relationships didn't work for me, I still really love the inspiration and the kind of history that this book focused on. I did want to read a bit of the author's note. So it says, the Davenports is inspired by a forgotten history, by the instances of Black success across Midwestern U.S. cities like Chicago during the early 1900s, places then as full of progress and possibility for Black people as they were in equity and segregation. It's inspired by the story of the C.R. Patterson and Sons Carriage Company, founded by a proud patriarch who escaped enslavement to become a wealthy and respected entrepreneur. So I, one, think it's so cool that this is focusing on a piece of history that is often not taught and not really focused on. I didn't feel like I knew much about this time period. I didn't know that there were so many stories of Black success and Black businesses at this time. And I think it was really interesting to see that part of history highlighted, especially when you think about this in the context of it being a YA novel. Some of these things are not necessarily taught in school. I feel like like I said, did not know much about this. So I think it's great that this is being taught to a younger audience in such an accessible way. But also I just think it's really interesting that this is based off of a real family and a real person, and this carriage company that the Davenports have, the father of this family owns. I think it's really interesting that it's based off of that. The fact that Crystal Marquis got her inspiration from the very few mentions of C.R. Patterson's daughters, there was not a whole lot of information on them, and she decided to write a whole book about them or like inspired by them, I just think is so, so cool. So again, I think like the historical context of this book is so great, and I think so important to be highlighted and for there to be stories about this. And also another thing too is that this is described as like the Black Bridgerton, right? So I think it's really cool for a younger audience to have books like this, because Bridgerton is such a widely popular thing, and maybe there are young adults that should not be reading the Bridgerton stories. They may be a little bit too young to be reading those stories. So to have something like this that they can read instead, I think is also very valuable. So yeah, I just want to say, like, I think the existence of this story and the fact that it is being marketed so much, I feel like I see this book on Instagram all the time. When this book came out, it was like on Amazon Goodreads. So I think it's so great that this story and, you know, this history and these characters is being pushed so much. I think is so important and so great. I just, however, didn't love the actual story and the romance. I found that I was the most interested when we were learning about some of the other things the characters were interested, these girls were interested in. Amy Rose, her character, trying to open her own business as a Black woman at this time, and when we would see Olivia go to these civil rights meetings and learning about what they were protesting against and what the rights that they wanted at that time. It was so interesting to learn about all these different things, but this book definitely focused more on the romance than on those things. So that was one thing that I just didn't necessarily love. I wish we had gotten a little bit more of things about the characters besides the romances. I wish we had focused more on that. But these girls and their romantic relationships was definitely the focal point of this book and these stories. And I feel like a lot of it felt the same. I felt like I was reading 4 different characters just experiencing the exact same relationships, especially once we got a little bit later on into the book and we got like the love confession scenes between these 4 girls and their romantic partners, because we do get all 4 characters their perspectives. And so there was a point where there were 4 chapters in a row and we switched between the 4 different girls and their perspectives, and it was just love confession, love confession, love confession, love confession, all the chapters in a row, the same thing. And then once we got to like the 3rd act conflict and the 3rd act breakups, the same thing. 4 chapters in a row, you just switched different perspectives. It was the 3rd act breakup, 3rd act breakup, 3rd act breakup, 3rd act breakup, over and over and over and over again. And I hate to say it, I found myself skimming the last like handful of chapters of this book because I just didn't feel like I needed to read the same thing happening 4 different times. The relationships just were not interesting enough to really be the focal point of the series, or this book, I should say. I feel like there were so many other aspects of these characters and what was going on in their lives that could have been more of a focus than the relationships. But there was more of a focus on the relationships, but they were just the same thing. They were just the same thing over and over again. I also was reading this when I was in my reading slump. I think this may have been why I got into a bit of a reading slump, because this book is not huge, but I just found that like my interest level would be way up and down. I feel like there were moments where I was a little bit more interested in this book, a little bit more was going on, and then there would be a lot of chapters in a row where nothing was really happening and I was just really like struggling to get through the chapters. I probably should have DNF'd this, to be honest with you, but I'm really bad at DNFing. I don't know, the romances were the focus, which is fine, and I would have enjoyed it if I had really liked the romances. I just felt like they were the same thing kind of over and over again, and I felt like some happened a little too quickly. I feel like they were also paced a little bit strangely. I think because this book is not even 400 pages long, but we have 4 different girls and 4 different perspectives that we're getting, so it was just not enough time, I think, to develop all of these characters and their relationships, which is why certain things felt rushed. The characters were fine. I didn't dislike them. I didn't really feel strongly about them one way or the other, which I think also influenced my enjoyment and investment in the relationships. But I think the actual like plot and characters and story itself was just not my favorite thing. So I think that this just personally did not work for me, but I'm still so happy that this book exists, and I 110% think there's so much value to this story. Of course, I think that it's so important that a story that is highlighting this piece of history that myself and many other people maybe don't really know much about, I think is just so important. So I don't want to take away from how great and important the history and the story and like what it's portraying is. I just think the actual story itself just didn't really work for me. And then the 6th and final book that I read in the month of March was Queen of Air and Darkness by Cassandra Clare. So I mean, I only read 6 books, but this is a bit of a chonky one, so, you know, it's all about balance. So this is the 3rd and final book in the Dark Artifices trilogy by Cassandra Clare, and this series very much is piggybacking off of The Mortal Instruments. A lot of where the world and the politics end in that series is explored, and the kind of effects of that are happening in this series, but you are following a different set of characters and different struggles, different relationships, of course, and it's hard to say without really getting into spoilers. Like, there really isn't a whole lot I can say about this. But I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars, so still a very good rating, but definitely my lowest rating of this trilogy. I do think it's interesting the way she took so many of the things that she set up in the first 2 books and the way she connected them in this final book. There are a lot of pieces to the puzzle in this series, so I think it was really interesting to see the way they all come together. And there are things that aren't like perfectly wrapped up in a bow by the end of this series, because there is going to be the Wicked Power series that very much connects to this one. So I think it makes sense that things aren't perfectly wrapped up, but also it just makes sense like where they are in this world, like the political climate, like things aren't going to be perfectly wrapped up. So I think it makes sense the way that things end in this book. There are a few things in the way things end in this book that I'm like not 100% satisfied with. I understand why one certain aspect of this book ends the way it does, because it's going to definitely continue on into the Wicked Powers, so I understand it. Certain characters just end up in a certain place by the end of this book, and I'm like, I hate it, I'm sad, I don't like it, I understand why she did it, but it makes me angry. And then there are a couple of other things that I feel like get wrapped up in this book that I just felt like a little underwhelmed by. They're satisfying, but they're just a little underwhelming. I don't know. It's, again, so hard to say without getting into spoilers. We will be doing a live show discussion on this book for the Shadowhunters read along, probably sometime in April, so I will definitely let you know when that is happening, because then I can get into my spoilery thoughts. Because another thing that I just feel like so unsure about with this book is there's something that gets introduced in this book, and this is the final book in a trilogy, and she's introducing a whole new thing. And I understand why it was set up in this series. I just feel like it was a lot to introduce in the final book, even though I like the way, this is so hard to explain without getting into spoilers, but I like the way it influences the story, how it connects to some of the conflicts, and the way it just influences the story. Like, I do like the way she connected it into the story. I just feel like reading those chapters, it's a little like jarring, and it's a little like, what book am I reading right now? It's just a little strange, but overall, I still really enjoyed it. I think it is, for the most part, a pretty satisfying conclusion, and I gave it 4.5 stars, like I said. But that is it. Those are the 6 books that I read in the month of March. I, once again, am gonna apologize for me not being a good book reviewer and these wrap-ups being a complete mess. I am the queen of stumbling over my words and overthinking what I'm saying, to the point where I don't know if any of these reviews made sense, but like I said, feel free to comment down below. We can have a chat about any of these books down below if you have any questions, or you want me to clarify anything, because me right now is not making any sense. Also, I'd love to know anything that you've read in the month of March, any standouts, anything you absolutely loved, if there was anything you've hated. If you read any of these books, let me know your thoughts down below. But that is going to be it for this video, so thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!